to take part to this exciting group. As a group, as you probably guessed, we are trying to shake a little bit many topics from a variety of point of views. So I'm very happy and proud to be part of this group as a founding member, also because there is a strong relationship, not just a scholar relationship, but a friendship with all the members of the group. So it's great to be here today. Okay, this is going to be the outline of my talk. First, I would like to start with a few slides just to tell you who I am, where do I come from, so that you will be able to decide to which extent I am part of the enactive movement, how much embodied do you take my ideas to be, and the like. Then I will move to define humans as the symbolic species. I will address briefly the notion of habits and social practices to get finally to the hypothesis on the so-called just so story on how we get from tools to symbols and a few obviously temporary conclusions. Okay, where do I come from? So I would like to start with a few quotes. This is from a paper I co-authored with Giacomo Rizzolatti, which appeared in an edited book edited by Jean-Luc Petit. Jean-Luc Petit is a phenomenologist, and to be honest, was the first philosopher who was somehow triggered when he realized through a paper of Marc Jeanneret about the discovery of mirror neurons. And in this paper, From Action to Meaning, we wrote, begin quote, the neurophysiological data we have presented here, which were about canonical and mirror neurons, provide a new insight about the neural mechanisms that might underpin the processes of object categorization and action understanding. Both these processes, in our perspective, seem to be deeply grounded in the bidirectional relationship between agent and environment. This relationship is basically dependent upon action execution. Action appears to represent the founding principle of our knowledge of the world. A couple of years later, something important happened, important to me. I presented for the first time the data on mirror neurons in Tucson, Arizona, at the second conference towards the science of consciousness, where I met Alvin Goldman. Many things started, and later on I was invited by the next year by Thomas Metzinger at a meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. I contributed this chapter, The Acting Subject Towards the Neural Base of Social Cognition, where I wrote, our complex experience of the world is made out of simple behavioral mechanisms, very much as our cortical circuits are made of neurons, whose activity is in turn made out of the ion's flow. In other words, among all these different levels of description, there is no ontological gap to be crossed, just a continuum of increasing organizational complexity. Neurophysiology, in this view, represents a sort of cognitive archaeology, and more than 20 years later, I still believe that one of the key functions of cognitive neuroscience is to provide elements able to build a cognitive archaeology. More recently, in 2015, with Valentina Cuccio, a philosopher of language, we tried to frame the mechanism of embodied simulation in terms of paradigmatic knowledge in order to address the biggest challenge for embodied cognition, which is the more abstract aspects of language and conceptual knowledge. we wrote, we provide a critical view of contemporary social cognitive neuroscience, arguing that the brain level of description is a necessary but not sufficient condition for studying intersubjectivity, the human self, and language, which are only properly visible if coupled with a full appreciation of their intertwined relationships with the body. And we use the example of Rosa, which in a way describes a natural kind, but on the other represent the declension in the Latin language, rosa, rosa, etc. So embodied simulation, according to this view that we put forward in this paper, consists of the suspension of the actual application of a neurophysiological process. The motor system activates, but movement is not produced. Reuse of neural motor maps without the movements they normally determine can be conceived of as cases of activation of paradigmatic knowledge. And we took this through the re-elaboration of the original idea of paradigma put forward by Aristotle that was proposed in Signatura Rerum by the Italian philosopher Agamben. The display of the rule exhibited in each individual case of actual occurrence, no matter if its display occurs when the action is performed, observed, or imagined, accomplishes its ruling role because of pre-existing biological norms and constraints which make it possible. So in Aristotle's paradigma, from paradigmumi, what stays beside, an example, a particular case, is understood because it is proceeding from what is best known and first for us, that is, close to our feelings, to our experiences and baggage of knowledge. Aristotle used the notion of paradigma in the rhetoric. So our experiences are therefore the measure from which we understand others and their experiences. And others' experiences are for us a condition for a deeper understanding of ourselves. I decided to start like this because along the years I've been somehow attacked. People like Sean, it's a pity he is not with us this afternoon, call me a body snatcher or a mild form of a scholar supporting embodied cognition, but perhaps not enough. It's always a matter of degree. It's to you to decide whether I'm a body snatcher or not. I definitely subscribe with this quote from John Dewey: "We are willing under hypothesis to treat all of human behaviors, including its most advanced knowings, as activities not of himself alone, but as processes of the full situation, organism, environment." So in a way, I subscribe to the 4E, although I'm probably not entirely convinced by full-blown enactivism. This may be, we will be able perhaps to discuss that at the end of the talk. Okay, let's move to the main gist of my talk, symbol making. So I think it's undisputable that we can define as the symbolic species. And I would like to start showing just a minute or so from this masterpiece by Stanley Kubrick, the first chapter of 2001 Space Odyssey, The Dawn of Man, where you see this hominin is looking carefully at these bones, for the first time realizing that they are not just bones, but can serve a specific purpose. always found quite telling that Kubrick decided to visualize tool invention by choosing a specific kind of tool, namely a club, a weapon, perhaps betraying what he thought about the most intimate essence of mankind, violence. Okay, so we got there. The Dawn of Man, as I said, the opening chapter of Kubrick, A Space Odyssey, beautifully portrays the transition from perceiving an object as a piece of matter to perceiving it as a tool. So the physical object becomes a tool. In the course of the history of archaeology, many tools were found. This is peculiar because it seems to combine two aspects. The aspect of the tool, a stone axe, an amygdala, but at the same time, probably not coincidentally, it has been manufactured so to have at its center this fossil shell. So is it only a tool, or it is already like a Ferrari or a Porsche car, a sort of status symbol for the owner of such a precious tool? We will probably never know. So what I would like to discuss with you today is how can we envisage the transition from instrumental to symbolic behavior? And according to Leroy-Guerin, already in the late 50s of last century, he was identifying in the tool l'utile as a trademark of our species. He wrote, the only biologically undisputable criterion to define the human dimension is the presence of the tool, l'utile. And these tools change their shape and also change in parallel, most likely, the cognitive apparatus enabling the possibility to manufacture, to build more and more sophisticated kind of tool. As you see, it's a very long time. We go from older one tools to Achillean to Middle Pleistocene, temporal spans that we can hardly grasp with our limited mind. So recently, Michele Cometa, in this quite interesting book, Why Stories Help Us Living, the Necessary Literature, I apologize for the clumsy style of the translation, which is mine. He wrote, it must be said that the tools are also the product of a narrative behavior, such as the chaîne opératoire, after all, is, of which Leroy-Guerin wrote extensively. It is the application of a temporal and operational sequence, a before, a during, and an after, but at the same time presupposes a narration, because whoever creates an Olduvian pebble, a double-sided or a blade, must be able to foresee, that is, to imagine, that a certain object may come out of a given stone and therefore must have a rudimentary idea of time and the possibility of imagining, if nothing else, what cannot be seen. So the movements and actions that for millions of years have allowed the increasingly skilled and refined creation of tools and weapons, the killing of animals, the constructions of shelters, of huts, have also started to be used to create objects of a totally different type. Material object whose main purpose was to say / represent something to someone else. Here is a long quote from Cassirer. This world, the human world, forms no exception to those biological rules which govern the life of all the other organs. Yet, in the human world, we find a new characteristic which appears to be distinctive mark of human life. Between the receptor system and the effector system, which are to be found in all animal species, we find in man a third link which we may describe as the symbolic system. This new acquisition transforms the whole of human life. As compared with the other animals, man lives not merely in a broader reality, he lives, so to speak, in a new dimension of reality. So at some point in evolution, something absolutely new happened. Utilitarian behavior led to the production of material symbols, what we now could designate as cultural artifacts. How did the new cognitive ability of symbol making emerge in the first place? One could speculate that symbol making be the externalization of a pre-existing symbolic thought. I want to challenge this assumption by positing that symbolic thought and symbol making constitutively co-determine one another once behavior is turned into habits and mere action gives way to social practice. A minimalist and neurobiologically plausible approach to the origin of the creation of material symbols, let's say the crazy job I assigned to myself today, I think can greatly benefit from the notions of habits and of social practice. So let's get to this. Again, Dewey, Human Nature and Conduct, habits may be profitably compared to physiological functions like breathing and digesting. The latter are, to be sure, involuntary, while habits are acquired. So pragmatism proposes a processual and physiological characterization of habits and considers humans as creatures of habits which are conceived as vehicles of cognition. Habits in philosophy traditionally were not very well received. They were not well received by Hume, by Locke, by Kant, and more recently by analytic philosophy. Fodor is one key example. Habits consist of schemas of perception, thought, and action, producing individual and collective practices, which in turn reproduce the generative schemas. The body with its motor potentialities constrains, limits, and dictates the range of possible practices. We can run, we can jump, but we can't fly with our body, okay? So the body determines social practices, but at the same time, it is shaped by those very same social practices. And it is because of the reciprocity of body and social practices that cultural artifacts are created. Here is another precious contribution from pragmatism, now from Pierre. The habits, according to Pierre, gives rise to symbolic expressions and produce meanings through would acts. That is, through dispositional potentialities that are, if I'm not mistaken, if my reading of Pierce is correct, both physical and mental. But these would acts, or this definition of habits as dispositions, can be connected to the notion of the motor potentiality that our body instantiates. Our brain body expresses the range of potential relations to the world that lead to the constitution of a relational self, shaping and delimiting the horizon of the world we inhabit. The horizon of our Umwelt is dictated by our bodily nature and by its intrinsic potentialities, which in turn shape and constrain the way our brain is mapping the relation between our body and the world. We come to know and understand our world, our Umwelt, as I said, through the relational potentialities instantiated by our body. How can bodily motor potentialities or dispositions that enable us to build, I don't know, those kind of tools I showed you before, be turned into the production of material symbols? What role do repetition and ritualization play in shaping the symbol-making practice? And here Bourdieu comes handy. Here's a quote from the Pascalian Meditations. Social agents are endowed with habitus inscribed in their bodies from past experiences. These systems of patterns of perception, appreciation, and action allow them to perform acts of practical knowledge based on the identification and recognition of conventional conditional stimuli to which they are predisposed to react. Again, Bourdieu in The Logic of Practice. The theory of practice as practice insists, contrary to positivist materialism, that the objects of knowledge are constructed, not passively registered, and contrary to intellectualist idealism, that the principle of this construction is the system of structuring disposition, the habitus, which is constituted in practice and is always oriented towards practical function. It is notable that according to Bourdieu's model, practices are acquired through mimesis, through imitation. And according to Monique Scheer, in practice theory, subjects or agents are not seen as antecedent to the practices, but rather as the product of the practices. The subjects exist only in the context of the execution of social practices. The individual subject in practice theory is not conceivable without a body. The materiality of the body not only provides the place for the competence, dispositions, and behavioral routines of the practice, but it is also the one on which and with which the practices work. The body is an actor and an instrument. The creation of symbols and the consequent cultural practices and institutions emerge, according to my hypothesis, from the implicit knowledge, the complex set of behavioral paradigms that individuals simulate and internalize mimetically due to the constant interpersonal relationship they have within their dense network of social exchanges from the very beginning, probably already in utero. Alfred Gell has been recently republished in a new edition of its Art and Agency, curated by Chiara Cappelletto. Is also interesting for the purpose of this talk because, according to Gell, following Pierre, the cultural artifacts and what we now designate as works of art are indexes. That is, they are agents endowed with intentionality that evoke abduction, a form of conjectural inference that goes from consequences to causes, thus allowing to appreciate the intentionality that led to their construction. And I think we provided empirical evidence of this abduction when we studied what happens in the brain of beholders when they are facing artistic object like this, cats on canvases. Something similar happens in our brain when we observe the cats on canvas by Lucio Fontana, where the consequences of the artist's action, the cats, lead to the simulation of their causes, the gesture of the hand producing them through an activation of part of the motor system of the beholder, which nevertheless doesn't produce any movement. Before being a system of symbols, according to Gell, art is a system of action, and cultural artifacts exert an action on the world. Art is a system intended to change the world rather than encode symbolic propositions about it. Visual art objects are not a part of language, nor do they constitute an alternative language. No matter what one thinks about this characterization of art, which has been criticized from a variety of perspectives, also from an anthropological point of view. Philippe Descola, for example, criticized it quite radically. Still, the idea of the agency of the cultural artifact is something that Gell perhaps presciently put forward in this book that unfortunately appeared after he passed away, but that resurfaced this idea many times in Tom Mitchell work, in the work of Belting for other aspects, or Bredekamp, not to mention the power of images, to quote David Friedberg, which precedes Gell. So my hypothesis is the following: the creative gesture that infuses material object with meanings that transcend their immediate practical advantages could be the result of the fortuitous discovery of a single individual, subsequently mimetically shared as social practice by other members of the social group, becoming the object of ritualized practices. I've been obsessed by these objects since quite a while. The Blombos cave, the shells with similar inscription, which dates even more back than the 70,000 years of the Blombos ochre piece. Objects like this could be the late translation of an individual fortuitous empirical observation. For example, this is the just so story. When cutting something on a rigid surface, the cutting activity leaves a permanent trace on it, thus revealing that a practice can persist as a material sign that supports it, even when the practice is over and its agent is long gone. So this discovery could have been favored by the constant exposure to the lived relationship between traces of animals and absent animals. However, the deer footprint stands for the deer, although it is not present, but these observations may not have been sufficient to lead to the intentional realization of symbolic objects like those graphic signs. My hypothesis is that something more is needed to create symbolic objects. That is, the possibility to internalize the causal relationship between action and sign by its actualization through one's own bodily action. Certainly something totally missing from the connection between the absent deer and its footprint on the ground. Once the connection becomes explicit and self-evident in the eye of its inventor, so to speak, it can be thought about, and most importantly, it can be displayed and communicated to others, hence triggering its mimetic diffusion within a given social group. A further element that might have contributed to the diffusion and consolidation of the production of symbolic object is repetition and its formalization into ritual behavior. Repetition is a very efficient means to learn something new, as we all know. When learning a new skill, it is common practice to mimetically repeat the instructor's display behavior with many repetition cycles until the gap between what has to be learned and what is reenacted narrows down and eventually disappears when we become proficient in that particular skill. Ritualization thus transforms behaviors initially repeated for mere learning purposes into a set of social practices that provide greater social cohesion and sense of communal belonging among its practitioners. So, ritualization as cultural performance, its relevance to the expression of symbolic forms. Ritualization is not peculiar of our species. Actually, there are many forms of rituals described in zoology. According to zoology, the evolutionary process by which an action or a pattern of behavior in an animal loses its original function, but is maintained for its role in showing itself to the other or in other social interaction. And we can think about the ritualization of certain behavior as at the origin of the expression of emotion, if we stick to Darwin, for example. He was a famous anthropologist, Victor Turner, who in 1973 wrote, "A ritual is a stereotyped sequence of activities involving gestures, words, and objects." And according to another anthropologist, Catherine Bell, the implicit dynamic and end of ritualization, that which it does not see itself doing, can be said to be the production of a ritualized body. A ritualized body is a body invested with a sense of ritual. So since ritual acknowledges powers beyond the invention of the community and implies correct and incorrect relation with those powers, it is often more likely to generate a social consensus about things. Activities that are so physical, aesthetic, and established appear to play a particularly powerful role in shaping human sensibility and imagination. Also because the ritualization is referred to a supraordinate entity, God, the spirit, the soul to some natural kind and the like, which also contributes to release tension and anxiety within that social community. So example of ritual-like behavior demonstrate, writes Bell, the importance of the body in its way of moving in space and time. The body acts within an environment that appears to require it to respond in certain ways, but this environment is actually created and organized precisely by means of how people move around it. So again, we see this reciprocal relationship between the body, the practice, the environment, with mutual influence. By means of the ritualization of shared social practices, individuals' imaginary worlds colonize the social community they belong to, hence allowing to infuse new cultural meanings into reused bodily performances through the repetition, combination, and memorization of particular shared behaviors and actions and their mimetic ritualization. So, through repetition, combination, and memorization, and by means of ritualization, those serendipitously discovered practice enable people to create symbolic artifacts. So one objection, what's the difference between this and that? I mean, a dance is a ritual and has a meaning for the community practicing it. What is distinctive of this symbolic object with respect to this putative symbolic practice? Ritualized performative practices like dance can be symbolic too, however, they are confined to the here and now of the body. While by means of performative symbolic object externalization, the cultural artifacts surrender meaning from the temporal hic et nunc finitude of the body, the here and now finitude of the body. I'm almost done. Several important aspects of human cognition and culture share a performative character that is they qualify as mediated forms of action. Through the repetition, combination, and memorization of particular shared behaviors and action, and their mimetic ritualization, the social group, through reuse, which is a basic way of functioning of our brain, infuses bodily practices originally evolved for utilitarian purposes with new cultural meanings. The gradual transition that I'm proposing here from the creation of tools to the creation of symbolic objects shows that utilitarian and symbolic behavior are both chapters of the same trajectory of cognitive technology. Second, does not require us to assume that the creation of symbols is the late externalization of a pre-existing symbolic thought, because symbolic thinking and the creation of symbols are the co-constructive result of the development of shared practices and habits. Third, it is fully compatible, at least in my hands, of course, with the neurobiological characterization of human relational potentialities as instantiated by embodied simulation. And this is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vittorio. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, and I also extend my thanks to the more than 90 people that were here to listen to you. So this is a huge success for us all. So thank you very much for being here. I also had a wonderful presentation of your work, but yeah, I could not do anything better than what you already did with this kind of auto presentation of your ideas, and also with the connection with the Enactivism, and also I would say in this talk with material engagement theory, because there are lots of connections of the idea of the artifacts.
Lambros' work is fully acknowledged in all of my recent papers. For the sake of time, I had to reduce the quotes to those that seem to me more pertinent for what I was supposed to say.
Of course. But I shut up because I leave the word to the audience, and then we will discuss about all that later. So if you want to ask questions to Vittorio, just click on the end, and we will give you the permission. So we have Mason Cash. So Mason.
I was trying to unmute and wasn't sure I had the power to do that. So I'm curious about one of the last claims you made about the sort of ritualized performative practices being, sorry, I'm not sure if I got the phrase right, sort of limited to the here and now of the body. In a sense, what we're doing right now, having a conversation, is a ritualized performative practice involving symbolic, but it's not just limited to the here and now. It's something that has some meaning that can be remembered later, that can affect the conversation further on.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's more of a spectrum than a sort of stark difference between the ritualized symbolic practices and more symbolic linguistic practices, for instance, right?
Yeah, I had to be to go perhaps too quickly. Thank you for your question, first of all. If I can add a little bit in order to make myself clear, with the last with that slide where I confronted the Blombos piece of ochre and those dancing individual, I meant that the invention, so to speak, of the symbolic object does not require the presence of the body. I mean, we can have a conversation as long as we talk, which means as long as we are both alive. Once we are dead, there's no more conversation, unless we transcribe it and we leave a trace of it into some notes or into some printed pages. So that's the function of the piece of ochre, that something can stand against time, even when the person who realized those inscriptions that keep us busy 70,000 years afterwards, you probably would have never thought that we are still talking about that bloody piece of ochre, but this is exactly what is happening. So I think if you think about the symbol as a sort of pharmacon against the sense of death, I mean, that's a possible way to go. I'm not going that way here today. I'm not prepared to do that. It's not my job. I deal with the nuts and bolts of this jelly stuff, which is here. But I mean, that would be a possible option. And so the object has the advantage that doesn't require no body. I mean, unless the body of someone like us is still looking at that object, when the people dealing with those inscriptions are long gone.
So, I mean, I guess I'm seeing more like, I mean, the words I'm using right now as a slightly more ephemeral object, something other people could perceive. It could be recorded, written down, and made less ephemeral. But I mean, the drawing I make on a beach that gets washed away by the sand, it's there, but it's only there for a while. So some are very fleeting, some are temporary, some are very permanent. It seems more like I mean, the words I'm using in a conversation right now are fleeting, but still there and processable, observable, recordable, sort of connected to my body. But even that sort of tool with the inscriptions on it, whatever that was, and from thousands of years ago, is still leaving the imprint of the actor. So any symbolic object is going to leave the imprint of the actor, but somewhere a little more temporary and ephemeral, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So while people waits and thinks in order to ask you something, Vittorio, since I start in order to break the ice. There is also Fausto, I think, that wants to ask you something. With 3 questions and 3 ideas that I think that are important in what you say. The first one is the beginning of your talk, the connection that you were doing with Enactivism in some way. So you were telling it's up to you to judge if I mean in the club in some way or yes. a little bit. I think that, you know, the key role of action for cognition is an idea that both Enactivism and embodied simulation share, and they agree on that without any doubt. Maybe a little bit of difference is the idea of representation, because usually Enactivists are radically anti-representationalist, while you, Vittorio, even if I would not say that you are a representationalist in the classic way, because you are not at all, but on the bodily side, you still think maybe that that one of the key job of our body, of our brain, is a kind of building some bodily representation of something that is not there. For instance, maybe we can tell something more on that, because I think that this can be a point of difference between Enactivism and embodied simulation. First point. Second point is all the things that I totally agree with you, with what you said about social practice, about the role, the intertwining between the symbolic thought and the symbolic practice and all that. So, for instance, one of the idea that always interested me, connected to material engagement theory, is the idea that once these artifacts, once these rituals, once these practices are established in some way, they scaffold in some way cognition. So there is something that at the beginning maybe our brain-body system allows, as it would be talking in Persian words. But when we have some kind of a grammar of practice, a grammar of tools in some way, these tools shape a little bit the way we think, the way we build our minds, if not our brain. And the third point is, to me, is a key term in your presentation. I would put it like that. Peirce used to talk about psychiatrism, a continuity between mind and matter in some way. You were going in this very direction to me when you were thinking, where you were talking about the reuse. This idea of reuse that to me, as an exaptation or as a reuse, tell me what you think about it. But this is a key term both for the brain and for the social practices and for the social way of building artifacts and all that. So this kind of reuse term can be a kind of bridge between the mind and the environment in some way. Three topics.
Okay, thank you. All 3 points very well taken. Let's start with the representationalism aspect of embodied simulation. I mean, you probably know with Sean Gallagher, we had endless discussion on this topic in a variety of places. If you ask me, I think that first I thought the disagreement was mainly a matter of nominalism. Then, because Sean also, it's quite difficult to pinpoint, because when he speaks of higher order empathy, he speaks of mental representations. I mean, when he quotes de Vignemont, she speaks of I was, to prepare the talk, I was going through the slides that Sean presented during his talk. So when he brought up the idea, which I'm totally against, of a high order empathy, which is a different designation for mind reading or theory pushed out from the door, comes back through the window under disguise of high order empathy. We don't need, there's just one empathy, which is the empathy of Stein, for example. So we don't need higher order empathy. So I don't know to which extent Dan Hatto and Sean Gallagher on this anti-representationalist stance overlap, or to what degree they differ. Anyway, when I speak of the working, the functional mechanism that at the functional level I sum up in terms of embodied simulation, I'm talking about bodily formatted representation, neural mapping, neural schemata. I'm not particularly fond of the notion of representation. I mean, if I use representation, I feel obliged to qualify it, because I've been challenging the idea that all there is in cognition is language and propositional attitudes. I think there's a lot that can be explained without getting to that level. So I can easily speak of neural mapping. The point is, and I discussed that with Sean many times, what's going on? So let me phrase it this way. If enactivism is interpreted in its most radical way, and sometimes I have the impression, also reading Sean, that, or Ezequiel Di Paolo, that it is interpreted in such a radical way, as long as your body doesn't move, as long as your body doesn't enact, but by enacting I mean there is some command being sent to the muscles that produce movement, nothing cognitively interesting would happen. And I think this, if this is what radical enactivism is all about, it's untenable. What about imagination? When I imagine climbing 6 floors with 2 big cans of mineral water, at the end of this imagination, I'm bloody tired, my blood pressure goes up, my heart frequency increases, and if you measure my brain activity, you see an activation of the very same brain areas, not exactly with the same degree of activation or the entire network, but there is a substantial overlap between doing, imagining, and observing. So this, to me, qualifies as a bodily representation of something, or a bodily schema, or a neural bodily mapping. But there has to be something which stands for something which isn't there, something I can't dance with. Half jokingly, I said, if cognition cannot be reduced to tango steps, there's a lot more than that. And I think embodied simulation captures that. Now, the third point, I think I never thought in those terms, but I think what you're suggesting is a very interesting way to go. This term has been, I started talking about neural exploitation with George Lakoff. In 2005, we wrote neural exploitation. Then Stan DeHaan talked about neural recycle. Then finally, Michael Anderson came up with neural reuse. And I think neural reuse is the best of the 3 definitions. So I dropped neural exploitation, and now I stick to Michael, and I keep using neural reuse. I think this qualifies as a basic way of functioning of our brain. So we do many different things with the same bunch of neurons. I never thought for any minute that we have neurons in our brain with a T-shirt with written, "I'm dealing just with language." I don't buy that. I mean, Broca is doing many other things unrelated to language. Similarly to the so-called mind-reading brain areas, do a variety of things that are not exclusively ascribing propositional attitudes to others. And we can also, it has been shown by Uta Fried, for example, that if you destroy bilaterally the so-called mind-reading module, this poor lady has prefrontal symptoms, so she perseverates, she has a confused mind, but she passes all the mind-reading tasks she was going through. So there must be a reason why we activate those brain regions when we attribute mental state to others, but that goes beyond the tautological statement that they activate because they represent the module of mind reading. I never thought why people didn't get mad because of that, but apparently everybody accepts that. So be it, not me. I can hear you. You're silenced.
I totally agree with you on that, Vittorio, totally. I would add just a quick commentary because it's important for our center. The idea that you need from the representation thing is the idea that something stands for something else. This is semiotics. It's the idea of science in some ways. It's something that stands for something else. So maybe we can build an agreement between enactivism and body simulation on the idea that what is needing is a semiotic idea in some way, not the full-blown concept of representation, but just the idea of a semiotic representation in some way.
Right.
But this is just a suggestion. So Fausto Caruana, then we have Simone Fortunati, and later Christian Mötzling. Fausto.
Okay, hi. I met Vittorio, it must be said, this morning, so it's not, but however, I have a question for you. I want to ask you if you can envision some kind of relationship between tools and language, tools that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk and language. I mean, going beyond the usual and the frequent hypothesis that words are tools, such as in Austin, but also in Anna Borghi and Felice Cimatti. Because if I'm not wrong, they emerge more or less in the same period, tool use and language. I mean, following bipedalism, they are both present in human and to a lesser extent in animals, albeit in a different degrees, of course. And they are less lateralized and more or less represented in the same areas, at least in the ventral motor cortex and in parietal region. So, I mean, to what extent can this parallelism be followed, and where would it take us, in your opinion?
Well, thank you for your question. I think it's a useful metaphor. I'm not sure how much and what there is more than the metaphorical account of language of words in terms of tools. I mean, the metaphor in itself makes sense. What do you gain by implying that words are tools? I mean, you inscribe language as the most powerful cognitive technology that we come up with, and I fully agree with that. Language is a cognitive technology.
Because maybe from an evolutionary point of view, there can be some kind of, I mean, deep relationship. No, someone say that tool use require systematicity through generalization, as language does. So maybe there is some kind of inner mechanism, or I mean, something very deep that put the two together.
A big question mark, if we go back to evolution, cultural evolution of our species. Just before connecting, I was listening to Pietro Montani, who was giving a talk at Istituto di Studi Filosofici, and he, in the discussion, I didn't dare to ask because I was running out of time and I was afraid to be late for my talk. But he made a statement. He said, well, You see, in order to speak, you need the descent of the larynx. Neanderthal couldn't speak, so they most likely didn't have language. But Neanderthal, now we know that they were capable of producing cave art as sophisticated as that of Lascaux or Altamira. And actually, it is just because of this new dating system. I hope I'm not mistaken, but I read it a couple of times. These paintings that were attributed to sapiens now most likely were done by Neanderthal around 30,000 years ago, when sapiens apparently was not arrived yet in that part of Spain. So if you can paint without words, without language, it's possible, but I think there are so many missing pieces in this puzzle that it's really that's why I said a just so story, because at least in my case we will never be able to prove that. My main concern is that it makes sense, if it potentially can make sense. That's my point. And I think I need to read more Bourdieu on that point of view. I'm not in principle against that. What I don't know exactly, how much can you explain by characterizing words as tools with respect to an embodied account of language which doesn't use this metaphor. Okay.
Thank you, Fausto. Thank you, Vittorio. First, I apologize with Christian for having cut his name, but it was written cut because it's a long name, so I could not read it properly. We have Simone now. Turn on your microphone, also your camera, if you please.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Vittorio, for your very useful presentation and very interesting. And I have a couple of questions as a scholar of religious studies. Well, actually a student of religious studies. Anyway, I'm pretty interested about your artifact and tools theory. But according to a different scholarship, I particularly refer to Tim Ingold, there is a sharp distinction between seeing an index, for example, as a form which was culturally imposed on the object, on the material, rather than an emergent form. I mean, according to your theory, talking about embodied enactivism, we shall not see anymore the tool making as a cultural and mental template imposed on a particular material. Instead, we shall see it as something emerging, as something which relates to the body, for example, making a simple form starting from the end. Anyway, I see that.
Exactly. That's why I superimposed the outline of the hand to the index. That's what Lambros is arguing, and I totally agree with him.
Anyway, I still see that the idea that we for example, Homo erectus imposed a mental form as if they were capable of imagination is still widespread in prehistoric studies.
But nothing that I said authorized you to attribute that thought to me.
Well, I was thinking about what do you think about, because I'm still studying for an exam, and I see that it's totally widespread as like the Aristotelian distinction between matter and form still persisting. I think it's totally wrong.
No, I with you. I mean, it's a co-construction which stems from the pragmatic interaction between what your body can do, what the material you're dealing with enables your body to do, and through the meeting of the two, something new emerges, which can be the shape, the form of the object, as you said. So I have nothing to object to that.
And so I got a second question for you. if possible. As a religious studies student, I would like to know, for example, if your theory about embodied enactivism can be extended even to rituals, for example, Christian rituals, which involves mostly the utilization of written forms of symbolic thought, and thus listening rather than moving, for example, in rituals. And I would like to know if your idea, which I totally refer to the Dance-Perber theory of symbolism, could be extended even with the ritual, which, for example, do not involve a bodily involvement with a total degree, like in, for example, ritual or monotheistic rituals. I don't know.
Well, I can't think about anything more embodied than the spiritual exercises by Sant'Ignazio di Loyola. Lo dico in italiano, since we are in Italy. Ignatius in English, I don't know. I mean, I have it up there. There was a suggestion a long time ago by René Girard, who's among Catholic thinker probably the most fascinating one about his idea of the ritual origin of culture. That is a very peculiar idea of that kind of ritual, the scapegoat and the like. Yeah, I mean, that's your question goes a bit outside my field of expertise. So what I can say is that even when religion, like monotheistic religion, like Christianity, uses mainly words in rituals, the body is always present. I mean, also I don't know the English for rosario, but I was an altar boy, so I had a very strong Catholic education, so I know what I'm talking about. And so that constant repetition, that synchronization of rhythm and pace, I mean, clearly is made for a purpose, to affect your body, and through the affection it generates in your body to activate specific kind of thoughts. But I wouldn't go any further because that's not my cup of tea, so to speak. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Microfono.
Claudio.
Sorry, I forgot to turn the microphone on. So thank you, Simone. We have now Christian, then John Sykes, and Juan Restrepo.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for your talk. It's always exciting to see you give a presentation. This is an open-ended question, but I was just wondering if you have given to some thought to the role of animal domestication in this process, right? Because whenever I hear about material engagement theory, I hear a lot about tools, stone tools, right? Buildings, the actual sort of physical things that produce. But it seems like there's a similar and simultaneous process going on with the domestication and cohabitation of animals. And so it's an open-ended question, but I was just wondering where that fits into this account of language and ritualization that you have.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. I was mentioning René Girard. So as soon as as soon as you mention animal, it dawned on me that during that seminar that we had together, he was mentioning, and I think he also wrote about that, some Nubian population that imposed to each individual member of the cattle the name of one of the member of the human community, of the village, because to make the sacrifice more poignant, they probably realized that if the animal to be killed, to be slaughtered on the altar, bear the name of one of the member of the community, then the ritual effectivity got boosted. So in that particular case, the animal stands for another human beings when the ritual leaves behind the terrible allure. He quotes Totem and Taboo from Freud, actually, the original, or the killing of the father. So the animal is a substitute in the ritual that take the role of a human. That's the only thing I can think about. But I know if to answer your question.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christian. We welcome Dan. Hi, Dan. We have now John Sykes. So, John, please turn your microphone on.
Great. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I had a very broad question on the possible place of temporality in future neuroscientific research, particularly as it seems that there's another way in which neuroscience is kind of intersecting with phenomenology here, similar to mirror neurons, because, for example, in the case of habits, a habit must have been instantiated in the past, but as you say, it's also very much defined by its potentiality, which must be in the future. And it seems that it would be difficult to cash that out in neuroscientific terms, apart from, of course, Enactivism and embodied simulation theory. So I suppose I had a broad question on how we might start to formulate even the question or an answer to such a question, particularly as you spoke about, even the here and now can be transcended in the terms of material time. So there's very, very complicated temporal questions in Enactivism, embodied simulation, and I wondered if there are any potentialities for particular kinds of research in that field. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I mean, that's a kind of terrible question. Terrible. I mean, it's a very good one. It's terrible not to be able to answer it. I mean, time is at the basis of everything I do. However, I spend most of my time dealing more with space than time. I was scared to death handling time, but I'm fully aware that time is the key issue. Anytime people speak of the specificity of a given response, be it at the level of a single neuron, of a cluster of neurons, or even a brain network which comprises millions and millions of neurons dynamically interconnected in a given network. What gives that specificity? I mean, what is the fate of that specificity when the triggering stimulus is not there? I mean, apparently, it takes you a few hundred milliseconds when listening to a melody to say, obladi oblada, or to be consistent with the day, Mr. Tambourine Man, or I don't know, the times they are changing. So what happens when you are not listening to that song? You may have not listened to that song for maybe 20 or 30 years, but all of a sudden you recognize it, which means that something hidden that all of a sudden is hidden, dormant, low metabolic profile. I mean, something I kept noticing in my experience of single neuron recording champ. I did it for more than 20 years. The more selective the neuron, the less the spontaneous activity. So sometimes we heard the noise of many background neurons. We tried a triggering feature, nothing happens. Then all of a sudden, a big spike like that comes out of the blue, and it keeps responding with a high selectivity. Unless you find the correct trigger, the neuron doesn't fire at all. But it probably fires at a lower level of intensity that is not captured by our filtering system. So sorry, I'm not answering your question because I have no answer to your question, although it's a central question.
No, I think that was, thank you very much. I think the key issue is that the time here isn't chronometric, exactly as you said, or in the brain, it's not necessarily linear. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, all the neuroscience of time is flawed from one point of view, to the extent that people believe that in order to time consciousness, you only have to measure how people relate to two-time intervals, to flash of lights or to beep. But I mean, we know phenomenally from our own daily experience that time can be quick or can never ending. It depends what you put between the two flash of light or the two sounds, which is something very few people, I mean, I'm not familiar with this literature, not recently, but back then I was scouting the field because there was a postdoc who was interested in doing something with time that didn't materialize. But I was kind of surprised that people treat time as just an interval. What matters is the interval, not what is between, which make a difference in our perception of time. So, but that's not my, I'm more on space than time, unfortunately, because it's easier.
Thank you, Vittorio. Thank you once again to John. Now we have one, you can turn your microphone on, then we have Dan.
Right, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. The image is frozen right now.
No, I can see you.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
We
great.
can hear you and we can see you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I'm interested in the opposite time scale, the very kind of long and deep time scale of history and the process of history.
Okay.
There's an archaeologist called Ian Hoder, which I think you might know him. He's been working in Çatalhöyük for quite a long time in the kind of very early Neolithic settlements in Turkey, and he's been talking about the idea of entanglement and how there's this process of growth of the entanglements of humans and objects, and how this process has its own kind of momentum and even acceleration. So for quite a long time we used, or humans used hand axes, and then eventually we started using many more things. And that multiplied and accelerated. So I wonder if you have a story about that apparent acceleration in history.
Yeah. By the way, Hodder never quotes Simondon, although Simondon was saying basically similar things in the 50s, in the early 50s. His doctoral thesis is specifically on our relationship with objects. He was a pupil of, I think, Canguilhem and Merleau-Ponty. So why the Neolithic explosion? Nobody really knows. I think it has to do with climate, with a lot of favoring enabling conditions that in that particular time, in those particular places, favor the fact that people decided to stay and not to move because they could I don't know, grow crops, or and that in turn had a multiplying effect, because I mean, if you stay, if you stabilize, and if you find an environment that can give you food without struggling to move, to search new vegetables, new animals to chase, I think that gives more stability to social groups, and in turn can favor all the mimetic, repetition, ritualization phenomena that I very quickly went through in my talk. So it might have been a combination of positive favoring conditions that I think one of the reasons why we are here talking about symbol making probably has to do also with our neotenic nature, which has nothing to do with gene mutation, grammar genes, the the crazy things that so much excite people like Steve Pinker and the like. So it's apparently unrelated, and other things. I mean, take Erwin Strauss. What happens when you stand on your legs? Well, of course, you liberate your hands, so your hands are free. But that's not the whole story. I mean, you totally change your horizon. I mean, when you are a quadruped, your horizon is limited by the main dimension of your body, while when you stand up, you can turn your head. The landscape, what we now call landscape, nature is, you can watch a longer horizon, you can distance yourself more with respect to the material world. So I'm not claiming that you learn how to distinguish subject and object just because you stand on your feet, but standing on your feet has something to say. It's an enabling condition without which everything becomes terribly more difficult. So I think it's a combination of all these partly independent factors that then combine together have an incredible boosting effect. I wouldn't know what to say else. I mean, it's a difficult question.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, then shoot, now shoot.
No, then you have to know that Umberto Eco's favorite book was a book by, I don't know if you know it, by Pierre Bayard, was called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read.
I know. The Unlibrary. It's the same talks. It's talks.
Now you're going to show us how to talk about talks you haven't heard.
That's exactly right. I'm going to say, I have no doubt that Vittorio gave a great talk. So I'll start with that as everyone else starts. Very interesting talk. Okay. Maybe you'll send it to me so I can catch up on it. So I actually was just inspired by the previous question. So here's the trick on how to talk about talks you haven't heard. The question about time and temporality, and more importantly, your answer to it. So I wanted to press you because, or maybe it's not even pressing because you didn't give a detailed counter, but I wonder whether part of the answer is no, we can't. I mean, I wonder whether, not can't with a K, but with a C, whether you think when we get down to something like the habitual capacity to recall a song, to have that kind of embodied memory, whether you think it's even necessary. So that's, you might want to call that habitual. It's familiar. I don't know whether that's a habit or not, because of course, as you say, that could be a one-off re-recognition. But of course, if you recognize it over and over again, if you're primed for this. You answered by saying, as often people do, but you didn't go further than this. And so I just want to question your own thinking here. Of course, you know where I'm heading, because we have a long-standing history. And by the way, in this territory, there are two things that can relate. One is that people have attempted to fill that out for the longest time by giving account of some form of structure, as you pointed to, which is a contentful structure or a memory trace, or something that seems to have the right properties to ground the content of the remembering, which gets revived. Now, I know I suspect, but I just want to hear where you're at with this. I mean, one answer might be a standard answer that we've encountered in the past is that's not going to be a propositional content or something like this, but somebody might say it's going to have to be an embodied representation or something like that. And I mean, this is where I'm skeptical, because I think that's a philosophical demand. The question then too might be whether you think it would be a simulative process or something of that kind, which again, new theories of memory, some of them have pushed in this direction, exactly in this direction. And again, why can't that just be why can't we go with the answer that you just gave, which is that you get these recreative tendencies, but there's an end, right? We don't know why, except that the environment prompts them under certain conditions and that's enough. Now, maybe that's what you were saying in the talk, and I missed it. So if not, I'm getting a cheap way of getting it.
I never thought for a while that we have files in our brain, and whenever we need something, we go open the drawer and take up the file. Still, it is a fact that I don't need to relearn how to ride my bicycle every time I get to my bicycle. Everything is full, is ready for me to, as soon as I get to the bicycle, my body knows what to do, and I can think about whatever I like to, or listen to music or whatever while I'm bicycling. The point is, there are enabling conditions that enable that schemata to become effective on the spot. So the point is this assembled from an uncommitted bunch of neurons that in the meantime are there, nobody knows for doing what? It's possible that those neurons, when I'm not riding my bicycle, are doing other stuff.
Yes.
And while I focusing on the bicycle, I reach the bicycle down in the garden, and I'm about to leave my place to go to the department. Those connections, but you see, I mean, those connections have to be those connections and not others. Otherwise, I would fall from my bicycle, which never occurs unless someone pushes me or a car traverses my path. So I am perfectly capable of keeping my balance, of bicycling, and simultaneously thinking about other things. So how can I do that? I mean, because the enabling condition trigger the proper response. The point is, what is this proper response? How do you frame it in terms of neural functioning? So I think there has to be specific connections that are shaped by the practice. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any relevance to speak of practice. The practice is a practice because it affects what is being practiced, you see, which translated in terms of the firing of my neurons in my brain. When I learn to ride a bicycle, there are some configurational dynamics that are different and remain permanently different from those that were occurring before I learned how to ride my bicycle. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
It's a dynamic process that is being recreated every time enabling conditions are there, but it cannot be invented from scratch every time. There must be constraint. You don't want to call them representation. Let's call them schema. Let's call them mapping. I'm not, as I was saying, Claudio, at the beginning, I'm not particularly fond of the term representation, but there has to be something that enables you not to learn to do things you learned in the past from scratch every time. And these conditions somehow have to be translated into an organizational framework in a coherent dynamic within a certain group of dynamically connected centers in the brain. Something like that.
Can I come back? That's encouraging. But I want to say, so I think I very much like the idea of let me call it a quasi-repeated organizational dynamic, because of course the sameness conditions are, you probably don't, even for a habit, want the exact same thing each time, because there's also got to be some room for variation and adaptation to particular circumstances. You're never riding the same bike in the same circumstances under the same conditions, even though broadly speaking. So I think that one of the other mistakes in this is, if to successfully act in the world where there are all sorts of permutations, you can't expect the thing to repeat repeating exactly the same response would be a failure as well. So that's where the dynamism comes into the adjustment. But can I just say two things in response? First, I mean, one is just to say, and I'll pick it up because it is tetchy in the literature, It's not about what I want to call that, because that's you know, that makes it a mere verbal dispute with people about what labels they want to use. Representations, at least even when they're not deflated, have certain properties that seem not the right properties to explain what we're talking about. Whereas I think even schemata kind of can raise a question of an entity that's stored and recovered, right? So the idea, I guess, would be for the.
To be honest,
Yeah, I was going to say it depends on the author. It depends on the author. So yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I think it's depending on how one technically unpacks that notion. What I would agree with you wholeheartedly is that there will be a pattern that gets recreated to some more or less extent, and probably that doesn't require anything. And here's the kicker. The kicker question is it probably doesn't need the storage of the idea of that pattern in order to be recreated.
There are some specificities.
I agree.
You may stick to the idea of the dynamic brain, which of course is the way to go, but nevertheless, I mean, if the fusiform face area in my brain screws up, yeah, I don't recognize faces anymore. If some part in my parietal premotor network go wrong, I'm not able to make my coffee with my mocha coffee machine as I used to. I will, or light a cigarette. I'm not smoking cigarette anymore. I turn to this bloody thing. But I mean, I could easily try to light the cigarette, to light the match with the cigarette, the crazy thing that apraxic patients unfortunately do. So there has to be some framework that has to be in place. Otherwise, everything.
Yeah, yes. Well, I mean, as you know, I'm attracted to Anderson's models on this.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's how you ask a question when you haven't heard a talk. And but I'll say,
Michael is going in that direction. I attended to a great talk he gave a month or two ago, and I think he's working on constraining constraints.
That's right.
The keyword was constraint, and I think he's right. I mean, that's a catch.
I encountered him. I can't remember now. I think it was at the McGill conference, and he was making the same move. And I think that's entirely the right move myself. I think it's the right position to be. So soft neural assemblies. Well, you're right. He also has in his spider charts, what you describe is more or less areas that are more or less fixed, which is compatible with the story you're telling. So it's not as if everything has to be as juicy and flexible and plastic. So you can allow for some things to be more specific. But the interesting thing in his spider chart is there's quite a lot that's just not specific. And that's the interesting point. So, and that would make sense of this model.
I try as much as possible not to think about that. But one of my colleagues, Luca Bonini, is actually starting with what could be a groundbreaking way to do cognitive neuroscience in macaques, totally free moving and wireless.
Wow. Okay.
Because, I mean, what we know about the brain is through the recording of animals that most of the time have their head fixed.
Exactly.
Not to mention humans lying in this noisy magnet with your head fixed, looking through a mirror on a bidimensional screen, and we build castles on that. If it turns out that when you are able to move, what you take to be committed neural mappings, okay? Let's put it, I switched more and more to mapping, which I found makes my life easier than when I use representation, even if heavily formatted. So I keep using mapping. If it turns out that the mapping are not the same, or that some mapping are the outcome of the specific condition where you're asking your questions to the brain, in the short run, we might be in trouble. Or at the very least, we must be flexible enough to revise a lot of ideas that many people, not me, but many people take for granted, like the mind-reading brain, the mind-reading module, and all this kind of crap.
I'm afraid philosophers have a lot, or some philosophers have a lot to well, a lot to admit to with respect to having driven people into a certain way of thinking about things, which have these methodological consequences that you describe. And partly that's the technology, and partly it's the philosophical picture. But I think that, you know, as the technology becomes more fleet of foot, you have the basis, and that's the history of science, of course. You have the basis for questioning the philosophical framework that's been holding you in place for so long. They go together. But great.
Or maybe in 10 or 20 years, we will discover that the real thing, it's not the neuron.
Yeah.
It's the astroglia. That's one of my nightmares. I spent my life dealing with the wrong stuff.
Yeah, well, why not? We've all been there. Thank you, Vittorio.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming, in spite of
yes.
the timing, not so
But
good.
then
Wouldn't miss
it's
it
the
for
middle of the night, so then thank you once again for being here. And we have one last question, as far as I can see. It's Flavio Valerio Alessi. So Flavio, please turn your microphone on.
Hi, thanks Professor Gallese for the wonderful talk, and thanks everyone for a wonderful discussion. So you talked about the rituals and their role for the development of symbolic thought, which is distributed and enactive in rituals, and the use of material artifacts. And my question is about emotions, and mainly the social ones. We were talking about religious rituals in which the emotional role of this, in fact, you know, ritual emotion, shared emotion is crucial. So my question is, could we say not only that emotions are distributed in these rituals and in the participants, but also that these social emotions are embedded in material objects? I'm thinking, for instance, the role of a coffin in a funeral, or the common sense of loss and sadness, so that the cultural and narrative function of emotions is scaffolded in material objects as affordances and material values, and not only passively recognized by objects, so that the emotional development of emotions is guaranteed by the presence of objects which embody social emotions.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is very reasonable, with a caveat though. And the caveat is the following: I don't think, from what we know, we are entitled to claim a necessary and sufficient relationship between a given object and a given emotion. That might change. If you think about the emotional value of colors, I decided not to do any experiment on that after reading an essay by Eisenstein on color, where he beautifully demonstrates how the emotional and social value of colors change in culture. So green stands for youth, stands for progress, but it's also the color of the eyes of Satan, of the devil. The same applies to yellow. Yellow is the sun. Yellow is the aura of the saint of Byzantine paintings. But it's the color of the robe that people were forced to wear before going to the stake and being burned by the Inquisition. So it's also yellow. So, I mean, there is an enormous cultural relativism. So it's dangerous territory if you want to go there. But yeah, of course, emotions are everywhere. So there's no cognition without emotion. This is one of the things we owe to people like Jaak Panksepp. Affective Neuroscience is a book that everyone should read, although it's 1998, sometimes a bit too mechanistic for my take, sometimes too overemphasizing a crucial part of our brain, which is the brainstem, but the juicy stuff from a cognitive point of view is upstairs, in my opinion. So also Damasio recently felt in love, Solms and many others, with the brainstem. I still stick to the neocortex for the things we are discussing. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is one of the things that I think most likely I will not change.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it's time to go to dinner. We have to thank Vittorio really for this gorgeous presentation, and it's been a huge session with all the questions. So thank you everybody, also for the people here that are.
Thank you, Claudio, because I think your idea to put together this group was really great. We are having a great time with this seminar, webinar, and hopefully will be soon also in a position to meet and drink and have social practices, not digitally mediated, like having a good drink and keep on discussing until the wee hours somewhere. And so I'm looking forward to the next talk and to our collaboration. I'm really excited about that. So thanks for this.
Thanks to you, Vittorio, for your words. It's been a huge success for everybody, I think. So we had a lot of people, so we will carry on also in the fall. And of course, the idea is to meet, I guess, in Bologna sooner or later all together. And as we did.
I'll be in Bologna in July for the film festival.
So me and you
in Bologna. We
will meet for sure, but we want to have also Dan and Sean and Lambros there.
Yeah, that's great.
But we will carry on for sure, and we will do also online, because we have now a new bunch of new friends. So all the people that are here every time. So it's an important treasure for us, our community that we have built during this month. So it's an important addition to our friendship in some ways.
Yeah.
I add my voice to Vittorio. You deserve a lot of credit here, Claudio.
Yes.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. So my last word is for Fausto, who is the last one. So for this first series, we will have Fausto in a couple of weeks. So and then we will just say bye-bye to the fall, because we're going to build something, a new series for the fall.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed